The porch light was still burning at 6 in the morning when Emmeline Fontenot walked out with the tin box under her arm. She was 45 years old. The bayou behind the house was quiet. A mist sat low over the water, thick enough that the cypress trees on the far bank looked like the shadows of trees rather than trees themselves. Somewhere out past the levee, a great blue heron lifted off with a slow beating of wings, and the sound of it carried, the way sound carries in Louisiana on a still fall morning, which is to say for a very long distance, and with a strange kind of clarity. Emmeline set the tin box on the porch railing. Her daughter Clémence was 12 years old that fall. She was sitting on the top step in a pair of rubber boots too big for her, and she looked up when her mother set the box down, and she waited. Emmeline did not open the box right away. She looked out across the yard first. The old barn stood at the edge of the pecan grove, its tin roof going soft blue in the pre-dawn light. Beyond the barn, the rice fields stretched south toward the bayou, and beyond the rice fields, the drainage canal ran east until it met the parish line. All of it had been Fontenot land for 4 generations. All of it belonged now to her. She had bought the last 40 acres 2 years ago from a man named Lyle Marchetti, who had once tried to take it from her by force. But that was a different story. That story was already told. She looked down at her daughter. "Do you know why I brought you out here this morning?" Clémence shook her head. "Because you are old enough now to hear the story I promised your grandfather I would tell you when you were old enough. And because your grandfather has been dead a long time, and I do not think he would want me to wait much longer." She lifted the tin box. It was a small thing. It was rusted around the seams. On the top, in letters that had faded almost to invisibility, someone had painted the words A. Fontenot, 1958, in what had once been white paint. The tin had softened at the corners the way tin softens after 50 years of humidity and heat, and there was a shallow dent on one side where a boot heel had once come down on it. Emmeline opened the box. Inside were 2 folded sheets of paper, brown at the edges, and a photograph and a letter in a sealed envelope that had never been opened. Clémence looked at all of it. She said, "What is it, Mama?" Emmeline said, "It is a map and a promise, and a war that was fought before I was born." She looked out at the bayou. She said, "It is the reason there is water on our rice field in the winter time, and the reason your Grandpa Ansel finally learned to trust me, and the reason I'm still standing on this porch instead of working for somebody else in Lafayette." She paused. She said, "It is the reason your great-grandfather Alcide did not die a broken man." She closed the box. She sat down on the step beside her daughter. She said, "It starts in the fall of 1985. I was 22 years old. Your grandfather had just come home from the hospital, and nobody in this parish believed a single word I was saying. The wind stirred the water. The heron called from somewhere far away." And Emmeline Fontenot began to tell her daughter the story that only 3 people alive had ever heard in full. The year was 1985. The fall had come in slowly, the way fall comes in Louisiana, which is to say, without any real change in the temperature and only a kind of quiet in the air where the summer noise used to be. The cicadas had stopped. The mosquitoes had thinned. The rice harvest was 3 weeks behind them, and the combines had been washed and parked in the equipment barn, and the grain trucks had made their last runs to the co-op in New Iberia and come back empty. The fields all up and down Bayou Maringouin were the color of old straw. Except one. Except 40 acres on the Fontenot place. Those 40 acres had water on them. Emmeline stood at the edge of the water gate on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. She was 22 years old that fall, and she was small, and she was thin, and she looked if a person had cared to look like exactly what she was. A farm girl, wearing a red and cream plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, wearing a caramel brown canvas jacket that had once belonged to her father and was 2 sizes too big for her, wearing faded jeans that had mud on the knees from the morning's work. Her hair was medium brown with warm chestnut and sun-lightened streaks running through it, and she had pulled it back in a low ponytail that morning. But strands had already worked themselves free around her forehead and her temples and hung down over the freckles that ran across her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were the color of the water in the drainage ditch when the sun caught it, light blue and a little gray and very still. She had a bucket in her left hand. Inside the bucket, moving slowly against each other, with a soft, dry clacking, were 300 live crawfish. She was about to release them into her family's best rice ground. Doyle Melançon's pickup truck was parked on the shoulder of the parish road 20 yards behind her. Doyle was 67 years old that fall. He had known Emmeline's grandfather, Alcide, back when both of them were young men, and he had known her father, Ansel, since Ansel was a baby in a crib, and he had watched Emmeline grow up on the same road he had lived on for 60 of his 67 years. He was a lean man, with a face like a leather saddle, and eyes so pale they looked white when the sun caught them from the wrong angle. He was leaning out of the driver's side window with his arm resting on the frame, and he had not gotten out of the truck yet. And he had that particular expression on his face that older farmers get when they are trying to decide whether to be polite or to be honest. He chose honest. He said, "Emmeline." She said, "Mr. Melançon." He said, "That bucket." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You gonna do what I think you gonna do." She said, "Yes, sir." Doyle Melançon looked past her out at the water she had let onto the field over the last 2 days. It was shallow, maybe 6 inches at the deepest point. The tops of the cut rice stalks were still visible in most places, poking up out of the sheet of water like the beard on a dead man's face. The water was already going tea-colored from the tannins leaching out of the residue. In another few days it would darken further, and the smell of it would change, and the mosquitoes would come back for one last season before the frost. Doyle looked at the field for a long time. He said, "Your grandfather grew rice on this ground." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Your father grew rice on this ground." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Now you gonna put crawfish in it." She said, "Yes, sir." He was quiet. He said, "They'll dig through your levees." She said, "I know." He said, "They'll eat what's left of your straw, and they'll ruin what's left of your soil." She said, "That is what I am hoping they will do to the straw, sir. The soil I am less sure about." Doyle looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he did something Emmeline would remember for the rest of her life. He did not laugh. He did not shake his head. He did not tell her she was crazy, or that her father would be turning over in his hospital bed, or that her grandfather Alcide would be turning over in his grave down at St. Bernard Cemetery. He did not say any of the things that every other man on Bayou Maringouin was going to say when they heard about this, and Emmeline knew, standing there with a bucket of live crawfish in her hand, and her boots 6 inches deep in soft field mud, that Doyle Melançon knew something the rest of them did not. He knew something, but he was not ready to say it yet. He looked at her. He looked at the field. He looked at the bucket. He said, "You be careful, Emmeline." He said it the way a man says something to a girl he watched grow up. Then he put his truck in gear, and he drove away. Emmeline stood at the edge of the water for another minute after his taillights disappeared around the bend by the Landreneau place. She wondered what he had almost said. She would not have to wonder for long. For now she took a breath and she walked out into the shallow water and she tipped the bucket and she watched the first 300 crawfish of her life spill out across her family's best rice ground. They vanished into the mud almost immediately. 2 hours later, on the other side of the parish, in a hospital room in Lafayette that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, a 58-year-old man named Ansel Fontenot woke up from a nap and asked the nurse what time it was. She told him. He said, "She's doing it right now then." The nurse said, "Doing what, Mr. Fontenot?" Ansel Fontenot looked at the ceiling. He said, "Ruining my rice field is what?" He said it without any particular emotion. He said it the way a man says something that has already happened and cannot be undone. Then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. 3 weeks earlier, on a Wednesday morning in September, that was already 93 degrees at 8:30 in the morning. Ansel Fontenot had climbed down from his John Deere combine to check a jam in the header. The combine was in the middle of the north field. The rice was going gold around him. I was 58 years old that fall. He was a stocky, sun-cured man with hands the color of walnut hulls, and a way of walking that came from 40 years of walking on soft ground. He had run the Fontenot place since 1972, when his own father, Alcide, had gotten too sick to walk the fields anymore, and he had run it well, which is to say that he had kept it in the family through 2 hurricanes and 1 bad flood, and the 18-month stretch in the early 80s, when the price of rough rice had fallen so low that 4 of his neighbors had lost their farms. I had never once told his wife or his daughter that he had been afraid during those 18 months. He was not the kind of man who told people that. He crouched down beside the header now in the heat on a Wednesday morning in September, and he reached in to clear a wad of green stems and unripe grain that had jammed against the sickle bar. Something happened. Something inside his chest. It was not exactly pain at first. It was more like a fist closing slowly around something soft and important. He felt his left arm go heavy. He felt his mouth taste like copper. He felt the whole field tilt slightly the way a room tilts when a man has drunk too much, and he understood with the strange clarity that comes to certain men in certain moments that he was in trouble. He tried to stand. He got halfway up. Then he went down onto one knee in the field dust, and he stayed there, and the combine idled behind him with its diesel engine ticking over the way a diesel engine does in the heat, and the sky over the north field looked from his new position on the ground larger than it had ever looked before. Emmeline was in a supply office in Lafayette that morning. She was 22 years old. She had graduated from the university in Baton Rouge the year before with a degree in agricultural science, and she had taken a job with a fertilizer and equipment supply company because it paid better than her father's farm, and because she had wanted for the first time in her life to see if she could support herself. The phone at her desk rang at 9:43. The voice on the other end was her mother's. Her mother said 3 words. Her mother said, "It is your father." Emmeline stood up. She did not remember standing up. She looked later at her chair, which had rolled backward and hit the filing cabinet with force enough to leave a small dent in the metal drawer, and she did not remember any of it. She said, "Where?" Her mother said, "Lafayette, General." She said, "Alive?" Her mother said, "Yes." She said, "I am coming." Ansel survived. The doctors called it a moderate infarction. They put 2 stents in him. They kept him for 8 days. The cardiologist, a young woman with a soft voice and a very direct manner, sat down with the family on the 5th day and explained that Ansel Fontenot was going to live, but that his working days were over. No more 12-hour combined shifts. No more August in the fields. No more lifting anything heavier than a coffee pot. No more anything that raised his blood pressure above what she called a conservative baseline. Ansel listened. He did not argue. He did not argue because he was 58 years old and he had felt his own heart try to quit on him. And he was not at that particular moment in his life in a position to argue with anyone about anything. But when the doctor left the room, he looked at his wife and his daughter and he said one thing. He said, "The farm has 3 months of operating cash, maybe 4. His wife said, "We will figure it out." Ansel looked at Emmeline. I did not say anything. He did not have to. Emmeline drove home from Lafayette that night. She drove home with her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and her mother asleep in the passenger seat, and the low white lines of Interstate 10 running under her headlights. And she thought about the farm. She thought about the farm the way she had not let herself think about it in 4 years. She had grown up on that land. She had walked the levees in the summer with her grandfather Alcide when she was small, and she had learned the names of every bend in the bayou before she could read, and she had helped her father draw and drain fields since she was 8 years old. She knew in a way most 22-year-old girls did not exactly how a Louisiana rice operation worked. She knew what a good year looked like on the books, and she knew what a bad year looked like, and she knew, having reviewed the account books for her father twice in the last 2 years, that the Fontenot place was not far from a bad year that could break it. She did not want to run the farm. She had wanted 6 months ago to keep her job in Lafayette and live in an apartment with a working icebox and drive home for holidays and get married someday to a man who did not smell like diesel. But her father had dropped to his knee in the north field, and her mother had aged 10 years in 8 days, and there was nobody else. She quit her job on the following Monday. She was home by Wednesday. She moved back into her old bedroom on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse. She unpacked the 2 suitcases she had brought with her. She washed her work clothes. She hung her canvas jacket, the one that had been Ansel's when he was a young man, and that he had given to her the year she graduated, on the peg by the back door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her father's account book. She read it for 4 hours. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday in late September, Emmeline Fontenot closed the account book and she pushed it away from her, and she stared out the kitchen window at the north field where her father had almost died 3 weeks before, and she said to herself in the empty kitchen, "This is not going to work." She said it quietly. She said it without any anger. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has been trying not to say for a long time. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were worse than that. They were slow. Diesel had gone up 11 cents a gallon in the last 12 months. Fertilizer had gone up $19 a ton. The price of a good replacement combine header had doubled since 1980. Rough rice, meanwhile, was moving the wrong direction. The last 3 years had all closed within a few $1,000s of break-even, and 1985 was going to be worse because the storm in August had knocked down 40 acres of standing rice on the south field before harvest, and they had lost close to 800 hundredweight to lodging. Emmeline looked at the numbers. She looked at the calendar on the wall above the stove, the one from Boudreaux's Feed and Seed, with a picture of a black Labrador retriever holding a mallard in its mouth. She counted the months. She said out loud in the empty kitchen, 6 months. That was how long the farm had before it started missing payments. Her mother came home from the hospital the following Monday. Ansel came home 2 days after that. He came home in a pickup truck her Uncle Remy had driven up from Lafayette, and he walked from the truck to the porch on his own 2 feet. But he walked slowly, and he stopped at the bottom step to rest, and Emmeline watched from the kitchen window and understood something about her father that she had never understood before. She understood that he was old. No, old, Not the kind of old her grandfather Alcide had been at the end, but old in the way a working man is old the first time his body says no to him. Old in a way that could not be undone. Old in a way that changed what the farm meant and what she was going to have to do about it. He came inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the account book, which was still open where Emmeline had left it that morning, and he looked at his daughter who was standing at the sink with her hands on the counter, and he said, "How bad?" She said, "6 months." He was quiet a long time. He said, "You looked at everything." She said, "Everything." He said, "The rice price for next year." She said, "Down." He said, "The diesel contract." She said, "Not renewable at the current rate. They already told Uncle Remy that in July." Ansel Fontenot looked at his own hands. He said, "Your grandfather told me once." He stopped. Emmeline waited. Ansel said, "He told me once that a rice field is like a woman with only one dress. You wear that dress out, you got no other dress in the closet." He said, "If you ever get in a bind, look at what else the field could wear." Emmeline set down the dish towel she had been folding. She said, "What did he mean?" Ansel said, "I don't know." He said it flatly. He said it without any effort to soften it. He said, "I never asked him. He said a lot of things toward the end I didn't ask him about because he was sick and I thought he was talking crazy. I have wondered about that one for 30 years. Emmeline said, "When did he say it?" Ansel said, 1958. I did not know when he said it, that the year 1958 was going to become the most important year in his family's history. He did not know that his daughter was going to spend the next 5 months turning that year over in her hand, like a stone looking at every side of it, until she finally understood what her grandfather had done and what had been done to him, and why the year 1958 had ended the way it did. He just said it. He said it once. Emmeline heard it. And then Ansel Fontenot got up from the table slowly, and he went upstairs to lie down, because his doctor had told him to lie down every afternoon, and he had made a promise to his wife that he was going to do what the doctor told him to do. Emmeline stood at the kitchen sink. She turned the year over in her head. 1958. She was still turning it over the night she read about crawfish for the first time. It was late October by then. 2 weeks had passed since her father had come home. She had been running the outside work with the help of a hired man named Cyrus Duplessis, who was 20 years old and slow but honest. They had cut and hauled the last of the south field. They had cleaned the combine. They had put the grain trucks up. They had drained the fields the way you drain fields at the end of a rice year, and the ground was already starting to dry and crack, and the wind was starting to come out of the north in the afternoons. Emmeline was in the front room of the farmhouse sitting under the lamp with a stack of trade journals her father had let pile up on the sideboard for 3 years without reading them. She was reading them because she had run out of other things to read. The stack contained rice grower magazines, extension bulletins from LSU, 2 years of a newsletter from a producer group in Crowley, and a single water-stained pamphlet dated 1979 titled Integrated Rice and Crawfish Production in South Louisiana. She almost skipped it. She almost skipped it because it had been printed on cheap paper and had gone brown at the edges, and because the picture on the front was a fuzzy black and white photograph of a man in overalls standing next to a screen box that could have been a rabbit trap for all Emmeline could tell. But she did not skip it. She picked it up. She read the first page. She read the second page. She read the whole pamphlet in 40 minutes, sitting on the couch under the lamp with her boots off and her feet tucked up under her. And by the time she reached the last page, she was leaning forward with her elbows on her knees and her lips slightly parted. The pamphlet described a system. The system was simple in principle. A rice farmer grew rice through the warm months in the ordinary way. After the harvest, instead of draining the field completely, he flooded it again to a shallow depth. The remaining rice stubble and straw and any weeds and grasses that had survived became habitat and part of a food web. The farmer stocked juvenile crawfish either from a source population elsewhere on the property or from purchased stock. The crawfish grew through the winter, feeding on the decomposing residue and the small aquatic organisms it supported. They were harvested through the winter and spring. Then the field was drained. Then the field was planted to rice again. 2 harvests, 1 field. Emmeline read the last sentence of the pamphlet 3 times. The last sentence said, "Properly managed and integrated rice and crawfish operation can generate additional revenue during the fallow period, without significantly compromising the primary rice crop, and in many cases may improve residue breakdown and soil condition in the subsequent growing season." She lowered the pamphlet. She stared at the wall. She thought about diesel. She thought about fertilizer. She thought about the 6 months of operating cash. She thought about the words her grandfather Alcide had said to her father in 1958. Look at what else the field could wear. And she thought out loud into the empty front room. Oh, that was the only thing she said. But something in the room changed. The next morning, she was up at 4:30. She made coffee. She put on her boots and her canvas jacket. She walked out to the north field in the dark, and she stood in the middle of it in the cold air, and she watched the sun come up over the tree line east of the bayou. The field was dry. The cut rice stubble was gray and brittle. The soil under her boots was hard. She stood there in the cold October morning, and she looked at the 40 acres nearest the pump station, the acres closest to the water gate, the acres with the best levees and the best access to the drainage canal. And she thought about what those 40 acres could become. She thought, if I'm going to do this, I am going to do it here. She thought, I have to talk to Daddy. She thought he is going to say no. She walked back to the house. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, and she wrote down every question her father was going to ask her, and she wrote down her best answer to each question, and she did not stop until she had filled 6 pages of the legal pad in tight, careful handwriting. Then she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. She waited for him to come downstairs. Ansel came down at 7. He sat down across from her. He looked at the legal pad. He said, "What is that?" She said, "Something I want to talk to you about." He said, "You look like a woman who has already made up her mind." She said, "I have." He said, "Then talk." She talked for an hour. She told him about the pamphlet. She told him about the system. She told him about the 40 acres near the pump. She told him about the numbers she had run on the back of an envelope the night before. She told him about her grandfather's line about the woman with one dress in the closet. She told him about diesel and fertilizer and the 6 months of operating cash. She told him she wanted to try it on those 40 acres, and she wanted to try it this winter, and she wanted him to trust her. Ansel listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he sat for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "What happens when the crawfish dig through the levees?" She said, "We reinforce them ahead of time. I have already priced the material." He said, "What happens when they don't come back to harvest?" She said, "We stock juveniles, not adults. They will spawn once. We will build the population before we start pulling traps." He said, "What happens when the field is still wet in April and we can't plant?" She said, "We drain by March 15. That gives us 3 weeks of dry down. Extension says 2 is enough." He said, "What happens when the market for crawfish drops?" She said, We are not going to make our living on crawfish. We are going to make our living on rice and use the crawfish to carry us through the shortfall. He said, "What happens when I am wrong to let you do this?" She said, "Then we are no worse off than if we sat here and did nothing while the farm ran out of money." Ansel Fontenot looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way a father looks at a child who has become, without his quite noticing, when a woman. He said, "I want to say something to you." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are going to do this whether I say yes or no. I have known you your whole life and I can see it in you. I could tell you no this morning and you would nod your head, and you would go out to that field this afternoon anyway. So I am not going to tell you no." He paused. He said, "But I am going to tell you what happens if you fail." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "If you fail, we sell the 200 acres on the west side of the bayou. That's where your grandfather Alcide is buried. That's the piece we have held on to since before I was born. If this thing you want to do costs us so much that we can't cover the note by next fall, that piece is what we sell first. That is what we lose." Emmeline felt her stomach turn over. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I want you to understand what you are wagering." She said, "I understand." He said, "Then go do it." He stood up. He walked out onto the porch. He did not come back in for a long time. Emmeline sat at the kitchen table with her father's coffee cup in front of her, and she looked at the 6 pages of her legal pad, and she understood that she had just without meaning to agreed to gamble her grandfather's grave. She did not sleep well that night, but she did not turn back either. The next 4 days Emmeline worked the 40 acres alone. She walked the perimeter of the field, first testing every foot of levee with a shovel, marking the soft spots with orange survey flags. She dug down at the corners to check the drainage tile. She measured the drop from the pump station to the far end of the field, using a hand level and a stick with markings on it that her grandfather had made in 1954. She checked the screens on the water control structures. She priced new screens at the co-op and ordered them. She hired Cyrus Duplessis for a week to help her reinforce the northwest levee, which was the weakest, and to install a small check dam in the drainage ditch so she could hold the field water at different depths during the winter. She drove down to Crowley on a Thursday to talk to a crawfish producer named T-Boy Melanson. No relation to Doyle, who had been running an integrated operation for 11 years. T-Boy showed her his fields. He showed her his traps. He told her which mistakes to make and which mistakes not to make. He gave her the phone number of a stock supplier out of Kaplan. She drove back up to Bayou Maringoin that evening with 300 juvenile crawfish in an aerated tank in the bed of her pickup and a receipt for $630, which was more money than she had spent on any one thing in her adult life. She released the crawfish into the flooded 40 acres on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Doyle Melanson was watching from the road. She wondered, standing there with the empty bucket in her hand and the water going tea-colored around her boots. What Doyle knew that he had not said. She wondered whether her father was right about her. She wondered whether she was going to lose the 200 acres on the west side of the bayou. She wondered whether her grandfather Alcide, who had died the year Emmeline was born and whom she had never met, would have laughed at what she was doing, or would have understood. She did not know. The day after Doyle Melanson drove away, a black Cadillac Coupe de Ville pulled up the Fontenot drive. Emmeline was on the porch drying her hands on a dish towel. She had never in her life seen a Cadillac come up her family's drive. Cadillacs did not come up her family's drive. Cadillacs came up the drives of oilmen and lawyers and bank presidents, and none of those men had any business at the Fontenot place. The Cadillac stopped in front of the house. A man got out. I was in his mid-40s. He was tall, but not too tall. He was wearing khaki slacks and an pressed white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a gold watch on his left wrist that caught the afternoon light. His hair was black, going gray at the temples. His skin was the smooth, even brown of a man who spent most of his life indoors, but understood that a certain kind of tan was good for business. He walked up to the porch. He said, "Miss Fontenot." She said, "Yes." I said, "Lyle Marchetti. Marchetti Agricultural Holdings, out of New Iberia. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." He held out his hand. Emmeline did not take it. She said, "Is my father expecting you?" Marchetti smiled. His smile did not reach his eyes. He said, "I called yesterday. Your father is not well, I understand. I did not want to trouble him. I understand you are running the operation now." Emmeline said, "For the moment." Marchetti said, "May I come up on the porch?" She said, "You may say what you came to say from where you were standing." She said it without any particular hostility. She said it the way a woman says a thing she means, which is to say, without decoration. Marchetti's smile shifted slightly. He said, "I represent a company that is acquiring rice acreage in this parish. Family-scale operations mostly. Farms in the 200 to 800 acre range. Farms that are in the current market having some difficulty. We are prepared to pay above assessed value. We are prepared to close in 30 days. We keep the seller on as a paid consultant for one growing season, so there is a soft transition. It is a good deal. It has been a good deal for 11 other families in this parish alone." He paused. He said, "I would like to make you an offer on the Fontenot place." Emmeline said, "The Fontenot place is not for sale." Marchetti said, "You have not heard the offer yet." She said, "I do not need to." Marchetti looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at a small dog that has surprised him by not being afraid. He said, "Miss Fontenot, may I speak to you plainly?" She said, "I would prefer that you did." He said, "Your father has had a heart event. Your mother is not well herself. Your operating cash is thin. Your commodity is depressed. Your equipment is aging. Your levees on the north field. I notice driving in are due for major work. You do not have the reserves for a bad year, and I have looked at your books, Miss Fontenot. I have looked at them because in this parish a man in my line of work can look at almost any set of books he wants to look at. And what I have seen tells me that you are one bad decision from losing this place." He paused. He said, "I am here to help you avoid that." Emmeline was very still. She said, "You have looked at my father's books." Marchetti said, "I have." She said, "Without permission." He said, "In this parish, permission is a flexible thing." She said, "You have looked at my father's books." She said it again. She said it the second time not as a question but as a fact she was letting settle into the porch boards between them. Marchetti did not answer. Emmeline looked at him. She said, "Mr. Marchetti, I would like you to leave now." He said, "Miss Fontenot, my offer today would put your family in a position to be comfortable for the rest of your father's life. I am talking about a number that is more money than this ground has ever generated in a decade. I am asking you to think about your parents before you answer me." She said, "I am thinking about my parents." He said, "Then let me help you." She said, "The answer is no." Marchetti looked at her. Then he did something Emmeline would remember later, as clearly as she would remember Doyle Melançon not laughing at her the day before. He smiled. He smiled a slow, patient smile. It was the smile of a man who had been told no by other Fontenots before her, and who had been through this particular conversation more times than she knew. He said, "Every Fontenot is stubborn." He said it softly. He said it almost fondly. He said, "Every Fontenot is stubborn, and every one of them eventually sells." He tipped his head to her. He walked back to his Cadillac. He got in. He drove away down the parish road past the flooded 40 acres where her 300 juvenile crawfish were at that moment working their way slowly into the mud and out of sight around the bend by the Landreneau place. Emmeline stood on the porch for a long time. She thought about what he had said. Every Fontenot is stubborn, and every one of them eventually sells. She turned the words over in her head. She thought, he has done this before. She thought, he has done this to my family before. She did not know yet what she meant by that. She stood on the porch until the Cadillac was gone, and the dust had settled back down onto the road, and then she walked back into the house and she opened the kitchen drawer where her mother kept the address book, and she looked up a phone number she had not called since she was 14 years old. The number belonged to a man named Theo Lastrapes. Theo Lastrapes had been her grandfather, Alcide's best friend. I was 78 years old that fall. He lived alone in a small brick house in New Iberia. He had come to Alcide's funeral in 1963 in a black suit that was too big for him, and he had sat in the front pew beside her father, and he had wept without any effort to hide it, and Emmeline, who had been born less than a year before the funeral, and who had no memory of any of it, knew about it, only because her mother had told her once when she was small. She dialed the number. The phone rang 4 times. A voice answered. The voice said yes. She said, "Mr. Lastrapes." He said yes. She said, "This is Emmeline Fontenot, Alcide's granddaughter." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Theo Lastrapes said in a voice that had gone suddenly very quiet, "Emmeline, child," he said, "you are not calling me for a social reason." She said, "No, sir." He said, "Somebody named Marchetti has come to see you." Emmeline sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. She said, "Yes, sir." "How did you know?" Theo Lastrapes was quiet on the other end of the line. He said, "Because he came to see your grandfather in 1958. He said, "And I have been waiting 27 years for the day he would come to see you." He said, "Come to New Iberia. Bring a notebook. There are things you need to know." She said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow." "And Emmeline?" She said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Before you come to see me, look under the 3rd floorboard from the north wall of the equipment barn, the one your grandfather laid down himself in 1959. Do you know the one I am talking about?" She said, "I think I know the barn." He said, "The barn has been standing since before your father was born. The board I am talking about is different from all the others. You will know it when you look." He said, "There is something under there that belongs to you." He said he wanted you to find it, not your father. You. He paused. He said, "It is time." He hung up. Emmeline sat at the kitchen table with the receiver in her hand and the dial tone humming softly against her ear, and she looked out the kitchen window at the equipment barn 100 yards away across the yard. The barn had stood there since 1948. She had walked past it every day of her life. She stood up slowly. She put on her canvas jacket. She walked out across the yard as the afternoon light went long and gold over the top of the pecan trees, and she opened the double doors of the equipment barn, and she stepped inside. She could hear her own heart beating. She walked past the old tractor. She walked past the combine header on its wheeled stand. She walked past the row of shovels and hoes hung on nails along the west wall, and the coil of chain hanging from the crossbeam and the small workbench where her father used to sharpen sickle sections in the evenings when she was a little girl. She reached the north wall. She looked down. She counted the floorboards from the wall. 1, 2, 3. She knelt down. The third board was in fact different from the others. It was a hair shorter. The nail heads had been driven deeper. There was a slight, almost invisible gap along one edge, the kind of gap a man might leave on purpose if he wanted a board to be liftable one day. Emmeline reached into her jacket pocket for her folding knife. She wedged the blade into the gap. She lifted. The board came up in her hand with a soft, dry sound. Underneath the board, in a shallow space her grandfather, Alcide, had carved into the earth beneath the barn 26 years before he died, was a small tin box. A Fontenot, 1958. She lifted the box out. She held it in her hands. She sat down on the floor of the barn in the last of the afternoon light, and she opened the lid, and she looked inside for the first time at the 2 folded sheets of paper and the photograph, and the sealed envelope that was going to change everything she thought she understood about her family and her father and her grandfather and the man in the black Cadillac who had told her, less than 2 hours before, that every Fontenot eventually sells. She read the top sheet of paper. The top sheet of paper was a map of the 40 acres she had flooded 4 days ago. A map her grandfather Alcide had drawn in 1958. A map of a rice field with water on it in the winter, and traps set through it and small handwritten notes in Alcide's Cajun French along the margins, and one line in English in the center of the map that Emmeline read 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. The line said, "Ideas do not die. They wait." The light in the barn was going out around her. The sun had dropped behind the pecan trees, and the last of the amber was catching on the north wall through the gap where 2 boards had shrunk apart in the summer heat, and the shadows under the tractor were deepening from gray to black. A moth came in through the open door and moved past her face and settled on the wooden handle of a rake propped against the wall. The barn smelled of oil and dust and the particular dry sweetness that comes off cured hay after a long summer. Emmeline held the map up to the fading light. The paper was brown at the edges. It had been folded 4 times and the folds had cracked slightly along the seams, but the ink had held. Her grandfather Alcide had drawn the field in fine, dark pencil with a straight edge for the levees and a freer hand for the drainage ditches and the low corner where the water always pooled in a wet spring. He had drawn the pump station as a small square with an arrow pointing to it. He had drawn the water control structure at the outflow with a symbol she did not recognize at first, and then understood. After a moment was a set of stacked boards, the kind used to raise or lower the water level in inches. Along the margins were notes in Cajun French. Emmeline's French was rusty. She had spoken it as a small child with her grandmother, who had died when Emmeline was 7, but she had not spoken it much since. Still, she could read most of it. A note beside the pump said the water should come on in early October, before the first frost, and should be held at 4 to 6 inches through the winter. A note beside the drainage ditch said to leave a small pocket of deeper water in the southwest corner for the animals to retreat to during cold snaps. A note beside the west levee said to reinforce it in September before the water went on, because the levee always weakened when it was saturated for too long. She read the notes twice. She understood reading them that her grandfather Alcide had already done what she was trying to do. He had drawn it in 1958. He had drawn it as a working plan, not a dream. She turned the map over. On the back was a second, smaller diagram. It showed a wooden trap. The trap was cylindrical, made of wire mesh with a funnel opening on one end and a bait chamber inside. There were dimensions written along the sides. There were notes on how deep to set it in the water, and how to angle the mouth toward the current, and how to bait it with fish scraps from the ice house in Lauraville. Emmeline set the map down. She reached back into the box. The second sheet of paper was smaller. It was a page from a notebook torn along the top edge. It had a list of costs on it: wire mesh, cypress lumber, a hand pump, repair on the levee, a stock cost in dollars that had been circled and underlined twice. The paper had been folded once, and there was a stain across the bottom corner that might have been coffee or might have been something else. Beneath the cost sheet was the photograph. She lifted the photograph carefully. It was small, 3 by 5 inches, printed on paper that had gone the color of weak tea. 2 men were standing on the levee of a rice field. The field behind them was flooded, and the water in the photograph caught the light in a way that made it look silver, like a mirror laid across the ground. The taller of the 2 men was Alcide Fontenot. She recognized him from other pictures in the house. He was maybe 54 years old in the photograph, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a straw hat pushed back on his head, and he was smiling in a way Emmeline had never seen him smile in any other photograph. It was a smile that showed his teeth. It was a smile that came from further inside a man than most smiles come from. The other man standing beside him was shorter and darker. He was maybe 50, maybe younger. He wore overalls and no hat, and his hair was black and thick, and he was looking at the camera with a serious expression that had a smile hiding in it somewhere around the corners of the mouth. Emmeline turned the photograph over. On the back, in her grandfather Alcide's handwriting, were 3 words and a date. The words said, Alcide and Theo, October 1958. Emmeline held the photograph for a long time. She thought about the voice on the phone that afternoon, the voice of the 78-year-old man in a brick house in New Iberia who had told her to come see him tomorrow and to bring a notebook. She looked at the young man in the overalls in the photograph. She looked at Theo Lastrapes, 50 years old, in October of 1958, standing beside her grandfather in front of a rice field that had water on it in the fall. She reached finally for the sealed envelope. The envelope was small. It was made of the same brown paper the map had been drawn on. Her grandfather had written a single word on the front in dark pencil. The word was Emmeline, not Ansel, not any of Ansel's 4 sisters, not her mother. Emmeline. She held the envelope in both hands. She thought about opening it right there on the floor of the barn, in the last light of a Wednesday evening in October of 1985. She did not open it. She held it against her chest, and she closed her eyes, and she made a small, quiet decision that she would understand better later. She decided that she was going to talk to Theo Lastrapes first. She decided that whatever her grandfather had put in this envelope, she wanted to understand the shape of the story before she read it. She put the envelope back in the tin box unopened. She folded the map and put it in the box with the envelope. She put the photograph in on top of them. She closed the lid. She stood up. She carried the box back across the yard to the house, and she went upstairs, and she put the box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet behind a folded quilt her mother had made for her when she was in the 8th grade. Then she went downstairs. Her father was in his chair by the front window. He was reading a farm equipment catalog under the lamp. He looked up when she came in. He said, "You were in the barn." She said, "Yes." He said, "Long time to be in the barn." She said, "I was looking at something." He said, "Anything I should know about?" She looked at her father. She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to. She said, Not tonight. Ansel Fontenot nodded slowly. He said, "All right." He went back to his catalog. Emmeline went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark and listened to the house make the small settling sounds a wooden house makes in October. She thought about what her grandfather had drawn in 1958. She thought about a man named Theo Lestrapes waiting for her tomorrow in New Iberia. She thought about Lyle Marchetti telling her on the porch that every Fontenot eventually sells. She thought about her grandfather, in a photograph smiling in a way she had never seen him smile. She did not sleep well. She was up at 4. She drove to New Iberia at 5:30. The house was on a small street a block off Main. It was a brick house with a covered porch and a wrought iron gate and a yard full of camellias that had not been pruned in several years. There was a light on in the front window. Theo Lestrapes was waiting for her. She rang the doorbell. He opened the door immediately. Theo Lestrapes was 78 years old that fall. He was smaller than she had remembered him. His hair was pure white and cut close to his skull. His hands were thin and spotted, and there was a tremor in the left one that he did not try to hide. He wore a cardigan sweater the color of old moss over a white shirt and dark pants and slippers on his feet. And he had shaved that morning, and Emmeline understood standing on his porch at 5:37 in the morning, in October of 1985, that he had shaved because she was coming, and he had wanted to look presentable for the granddaughter of his best friend. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes filled up. He did not let the tears fall. He held them the way old men hold tears in the folds of the eyelids until they went back down. He said, "You look like him." She said, "Mr. Lestrapes," he said. "Theo, please. To an Alcide's grandchild I am Theo." He stepped aside. He said, "Come in." She came in. The house was small and neat and smelled of coffee and old books. There were photographs along the wall of the front hall, and Emmeline saw as she passed them that many of the photographs were of children and grandchildren and men in fishing boats, and one photograph near the doorway of the kitchen of Alcide Fontenot and Theo Lestrapes standing beside a horse. She would look at that photograph again later. She did not stop for it now. Theo led her to the kitchen. He poured coffee. He set out cream in a small pitcher. He put a plate of pain perdu on the table between them, which he must have made that morning, because it was still warm, and Emmeline understood again that this man had been up before her, because she was coming, and had made her breakfast and had done these things because his best friend had died in 1963 and had left behind a granddaughter he had never met, and this was perhaps the day he had been waiting to sit across a table from her. They sat. They ate a little. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Theo Lestrapes set his coffee cup down. He said, "Did you find the box?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Did you open the envelope?" She said, "No, sir." He looked at her. He said, "Why not?" She said, "I wanted to hear the story from you first." Theo Lestrapes was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled a small, tired smile, and he nodded once, and he said, "You are your grandfather's blood." He said, "All right, I will tell you." The story began in 1954. That was the year Alcide Fontenot first started thinking about crawfish. Alcide was 50 years old that year. He had come home from the war in 1946 and had taken over the farm from his own father. And he had grown rice for 8 straight years, and he had been, by every measure, a farmer's neighbors used a good rice farmer. But rice in the mid-1950s in Iberia Parish was starting to change. The federal price supports were shifting. The equipment was getting bigger and more expensive. The margins were tightening. Alcide had begun in 1954 to look at his fields in the winter and to see them differently. He had begun to notice, Theo said, that the fields sat idle from October to April. 6 months of the year the Fontenot ground did nothing. It grew weeds. It froze. It flooded from the rain and drained from the sun, and produced not $1 of revenue for half of every year. And every year it did this, and every year Alcide watched it do this, and every year he thought there had to be something else. I had heard about crawfish farming. There were men in Louisiana in the 1950s who were beginning to raise crawfish in ponds. Not many. It was a fringe idea. The market was small and unstable. Most crawfish that people ate in that decade were caught wild in ditches and swamps by men with dip nets who worked at night. But Alcide had seen it done. I had seen it done at a small operation up near Rain, run by a Cajun named Odilon Butte. And he had come home from Odilon's place in the summer of 1955, and he had said to his wife, who was Emmeline's grandmother, Ozélie, that he was going to put water on the North 40 in the winter and see what happened. Ozélie had told him he was crazy, but she had also told him she loved him. She had not stopped him. Alcide had started small. I had flooded 20 acres in the fall of 1955. He had stocked them with wild crawfish he and Theo had caught in 5 nights of dip netting in the marsh south of Del Cambra. He had let the field sit through the winter. He had checked traps in the spring. The first year had been terrible. The crawfish had not thrived. The stock had been too small. The water had gotten too warm in a February heat wave, and half the population had died. Alcide had harvested 700 pounds and had sold them at the ice house for less than the cost of the wire he had used to build the traps. But he had learned. I had done it again in 1956. Better. He had learned what depth to hold the water. He had learned when to stock and when to let the population settle. He had learned to leave the deeper channel in the southwest corner, because the crawfish needed a place to retreat when it got cold. By 1957, he was making money on the crawfish. Not much, but some. Enough to cover the pumping cost. Enough to make the winter earn its keep. By 1958, Alcide Fontenot had a working system. I had drawn the map. He had written the notes. He had photographed himself standing on the levee with Theo Lestrapes in October of that year because he had understood, standing there with the water shining behind him, that he was doing something no one else in Iberia Parish was doing, and he had wanted a record. He had been 54 years old. He had been happy in a way Theo said that he had not been happy since before the war. Then Vincent Marchetti had come to see him. Vincent Marchetti was Lyle Marchetti's father. I had been 43 years old in 1958. He had come to Iberia Parish in 1952 with a wife and 2 children and a small inheritance from his own father, who had run a produce brokerage in New Orleans. Vincent had used the money to buy land. He had bought 200 acres from a family that had lost the man of the house to a tractor accident. He had bought another 140 from a widow who could not run her place alone. He had bought over 5 years more than 1,000 acres of Iberia Parish rice ground, and he had rented most of it out to sharecroppers and had done well by it. And he had begun by the late 1950s to be a man that other farmers had begun to hate quietly at their kitchen tables without saying so out loud. Vincent Marchetti had come to see Alcide Fontenot in September of 1958. He had come the way his son would come to see Emmeline 27 years later. He had come in a big car and a pressed shirt and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had offered to buy the Fontenot place. Alcide had told him no. Vincent had come back a second time in October. He had offered more. Alcide had told him no again. Vincent had come back a third time in November. This time Theo said Vincent had not offered money. Vincent had said to Alcide, sitting on the porch of the Fontenot house with a glass of iced tea in his hand, "You are doing something interesting on that back 40. Alcide had said, I am. Vincent had said, I have been watching. Alcide had said, so has everybody else. Vincent had said, I have been watching more carefully than everybody else. I know what you are doing. I know it works. I know it can be scaled. I know what it would be worth in 20 years. Alcide had said, then you know what I know. Vincent had said, I know more than you know. I know what a man could do with 1,000 acres of it, and 1,000 more and 1,000 more after that. I know what it would be worth to control it before other men figure out how to do it themselves. Alcide had said, you are asking me to sell you the map. Vincent had said, I am asking you to sell me the land. The map comes with the land. Alcide had said no. Vincent had sat quiet for a long time. Then Vincent had said, Alcide, you are going to be sorry. He had said it softly. He had said it the way a man says a thing when the thing has already been decided. Then Vincent Marchetti had stood up and he had walked to his car and he had driven away down the parish road toward New Iberia and Alcide. Fontenot had watched him go. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in the middle of November of 1958, someone put a shovel through the northwest levee of Alcide Fontenot's flooded rice field. Theo Lastrapes stopped speaking. He looked down at his hands. He said, you need to understand what a shovel through a levee means. He said, it means the water goes out in one night. It means every crawfish in that field goes out with the water. It means every hour of work of every day for 4 years goes out with the water. It means the man who did it stood on a levee with a shovel in the dark and decided that he was going to end another man's living because that other man had told him no. He said, it is the kind of thing that changes a man. Emmeline said, my grandfather. Theo said, your grandfather did not recover. He said it flatly. He said it the way a man says a thing that has been true for 27 years and has not gotten any less true with the passing. He said he rebuilt the levee. He drained the mud. He restocked the field the next year. He tried Emmeline. He tried for 3 more winters. But something in him had gone quiet. He never trusted the water again. He never trusted the idea again. He never trusted his neighbors again, because he did not know which one of them had done it, and he did not know which of them had told Vincent Marchetti where the weak spot in the levee was. He said by 1961 your grandfather had drained the field for good. He said he was going back to rice only. He said the crawfish had not been worth it. He said it to me in this kitchen in a chair very close to the one you are sitting in, and I did not believe him then, and I do not believe him now. He said he did not stop believing. He stopped fighting. He said, that is a different thing. Emmeline did not speak. Theo Lastrapes looked up at her. He said, he drew the map anyway. He wrote the notes anyway. He put it all in the tin box anyway. He did not do that for himself. He did it for whoever came next. And I know he did it for you because in 1963, when your grandfather knew he was dying, he told me to remember 2 things. He told me to remember where the box was, and he told me to remember that if a Marchetti ever came up the drive again, that would be the day someone in your family was ready to finish what he started. He said, Lyle Marchetti came up your drive yesterday. He said, that was the day. Emmeline felt her hands begin to shake. She put them in her lap under the table. She did not want Theo Lastrapes to see them. He saw them anyway. He reached across the table and he put his own hand over both of hers. His hand was thin and warm and steady. He said, you are going to be all right, child. He said, but you need to know one more thing before you go home. She said, yes, sir. He said, the Marchettis have not stopped. He said, Vincent died in 1979. Lyle took over. Lyle has bought 13 family farms in this parish alone in the last 8 years. 12 of them he bought through his holding company. One of them he burned down, and then he bought the ground from the widow when she could not afford to rebuild. He said, "I am telling you this so you understand what you are up against." He said, "Your levy is not going to hold if you leave it the way it is." He said, "You need to reinforce it. You need to be watching it. You need to assume from this day forward that a shovel will come through it on some night this winter when you are not looking." He paused. He said, "And you need to catch the man who does it." Emmeline drove home from New Iberia at 9 in the morning. She did not remember much of the drive. She remembered the sun coming up over the sugar cane on the east side of the road. She remembered the smell of wood smoke from a burn pile somewhere north of Lauraville. She remembered the way her own hands looked on the steering wheel of her pickup truck, thinner and smaller than she thought her hands should look for what they were about to have to do. She got home at 9:45. She did not go into the house. She drove past the house, up the tractor track, past the equipment barn and the pump station, all the way out to the northwest corner of the flooded 40 acres. She parked. She got out. She walked the levee. She walked it slowly. She stopped every few feet. She knelt down and pressed her palm against the wet clay. She listened for the sound of water moving in a place water should not be moving. She noted every soft spot. She noted where the vegetation on the levee looked stressed, and where it looked healthy, and where the ground had started to sag under the weight of the water she had put on it 4 days ago. She was looking, though she would not have said so out loud, for the place where a man with a shovel would come. She marked 3 soft spots with orange survey flags before she was done. She drove into town that afternoon. She stopped at Guillot Hardware. She bought 600 pounds of riprap stone, a roll of galvanized hardware cloth, 100 feet of number 9 wire, a small trail camera of the kind hunters use to monitor deer stands, and a padlock for the water gate. She spent $238. It was money the farm did not have. She spent it anyway. She drove home. She unloaded the truck. She spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the 3 soft spots on the northwest levee with riprap and hardware cloth, working alone in the fading light. And when Cyrus Duplessis came by at 4 to see if she needed help, she said yes, and he stayed and worked with her until the sun went down. They finished at 7:15. She paid Cyrus $12 and gave him a jar of her mother's fig preserves. She went inside. She ate a bowl of gumbo her mother had left on the stove. She sat at the kitchen table with the trail camera and the padlock in front of her, and she thought about where to put the camera so that a man coming to the levee at night would not see it. She decided on a cypress tree. The cypress tree was 30 yards north of the northwest levee. Its trunk was thick and gnarled and split by lightning years before, and there was a natural crook in the wood at chest height that would hold the camera and hide it from the road and give it a line of sight straight down the levee to the water gate. She would install it in the morning. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the sealed envelope on the top shelf of her closet. She thought about it for a long time. At 1 in the morning, she got up. She turned on the lamp on her bedside table. She took the tin box down from the closet. She sat on the edge of her bed with the box in her lap. She lifted out the envelope with her grandfather's handwriting on the front. She held it in both hands. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It had been folded twice. Alcide Fontenot's leaning handwriting covered the front and the back and continued onto a second small sheet that was tucked behind the first. The letter began, Emmeline. She had never in her life read her own name written by her grandfather's hand. He had died before her first birthday. There were no birthday cards from him. There were no Christmas notes. There was no yearbook he had signed. She had grown up with photographs of him on the wall and stories from her father, and a pair of his gloves in the workshop that she had held once as a small child, and that was all. She had never had anything from him with her name on it. Now she did. She read the letter. It said, "Emmeline, if you are reading this, then Ansel has died or Ansel has given up, and either way you are alone with the farm the way I was alone with it in 1958. I do not know when you will read this. I do not know how old you will be. I only know that you will find it because I have told Theo Lastrapes where the box is, and I have told him to make sure that when the time comes you find it. There are 3 things I need to tell you. The first thing is that the water works. You will already know this by the time you read this letter, or you will find out shortly. The water works. It has worked. I ran it for 3 winters. I made money on it. I would have made more if I had been left alone. Do not doubt the water. Do not doubt the field. Do not doubt yourself. The idea is sound. It has always been sound. It will still be sound in whatever year you are reading this in. The second thing is that you will not be left alone. There is a family in this parish. Their name is Marchetti. They came here in 1952. They have been buying farms. They will keep buying farms. When they see what you are doing, they will come to your door with an offer, and when you tell them no, they will come to your levee with a shovel. This is what they did to me in November of 1958. I do not know why I did not fight them harder. I have wondered for 5 years now, sitting here writing this, why I did not fight them harder. I think it was because Jose Lee had just gotten sick, and I was afraid to lose more than I had already lost. I do not want you to make the same choice I made. I want you to fight them. The third thing, Emmeline is the most important thing. I built this alone. I did not tell my neighbors. I did not tell my church. I did not tell any man in this parish what I was trying to do, because I was afraid that if I told them they would laugh, or they would steal it, or they would think me a fool. I was wrong. The men in this parish are not fools. Some of them are cruel. Some of them are small. But most of them are like your grandmother's father, and like my brother Cyprian, and like Doyle Melançon's father, who was my closest neighbor for 30 years. They are men who help. They are men who show up when a levee breaks. They are men who bring their sons and their shovels and their pickup trucks in the middle of the night when they see the light on in another man's barn. I did not let them help me. That was my mistake. That was my only real mistake. Do not make it, Emmeline. Find the men who laughed at you first. Those are the men who will fight for you last. I love you, child. I loved you when I held you in the hospital the day you were born. I loved you when I held you at your baptism. I love you now, sitting in the front room of this old farmhouse in September of 1963, writing to a granddaughter I know I am not going to live to see grow. You will do what I could not. I know it. Your grandfather, Alcide. Emmeline read the letter twice. Then she read the letter a third time. Then she put the letter down on the bed beside her, and she put her hands over her face, and she wept quietly alone in her bedroom at 1:30 in the morning, in October of 1985, for a man she had never met and who had loved her anyway. She wept for a long time. When she stopped, she picked up the letter and she folded it and she put it back in the envelope and she put the envelope back in the tin box and she put the tin box back on the top shelf of the closet. She washed her face at the bathroom sink. She looked at herself in the mirror. She said in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "I am not going to let them take it." She said it once. She said it quietly. But she said it, and something in the house, or in her, or in the still, cool October night around her, seemed to move slightly and settle. She went back to bed. She slept the rest of the night without dreaming. The next 4 weeks passed, the way winter weeks pass on a working farm, which is to say slowly and quickly at the same time. She installed the trail camera in the cypress tree the morning after she read the letter. She checked it every 3 days. It caught raccoons. It caught 2 nutria. It caught once a great blue heron standing on the levee in the very early morning light with a small silver fish in its beak. It did not catch a man. Not yet. She stocked another 200 juvenile crawfish in the 3rd week of October. She spread them across the field in 3 different release points. She built and set 30 traps of her grandfather's design, using the diagram from the tin box, and she baited them with fish scraps from the ice house in Lauraville, exactly the way her grandfather had baited his in 1958. She caught 2 crawfish in the 1st week. She caught 7 in the 2nd. She caught none in the 3rd. She began in the 3rd week to worry. She began in the 4th week to hear the whispers again. They had never really stopped. She heard them now at the co-op when she went in for a new pump belt. She heard them at the gas station on the highway. She heard them one Sunday in the parking lot of the church. Her mother made her attend once a month, though Emmeline had stopped believing in God the year her grandmother died, and had never quite started believing again. The whispers said the same things they had said in September. The Fontenot girl, 22 years old, running the place because her daddy had a heart attack, trying to make a rice field into a crawfish pond. Not going to make it. Going to lose the farm. Marchetti will pick it up cheap. Marchetti always does. The whispers ran together after a while. Emmeline stopped going into town for anything she could not order by mail. She kept working. She reinforced the other 2 levees. She repaired the pump. She winterized the tractor. She helped her father to the porch every afternoon for the fresh air his cardiologist had recommended, and she read the account book to him twice a week, and she did not tell him about the letter from her grandfather, and she did not tell him about Theo Lastrapes, and she did not tell him about the man with the shovel who was, she was now certain, going to come. The rain came on the 14th of November. It came in soft at first. A steady drizzle from a low gray sky. It lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, and by dark it had turned harder, and by 10 o'clock at night, it was the kind of rain that comes down in sheets and sounds like a train against a tin roof. Emmeline stood at the kitchen window and watched it. She watched the yard fill. She watched the drainage ditch beside the drive begin to move. She watched the parish road turn shiny and black in the light from the porch. She said to her father, who was in his chair with the catalog on his knee, "I need to check the levee." He said, "In this." She said, "In this." He said, "Take the flashlight." She took the flashlight. She took her canvas jacket. She took her boots. She walked out into the rain. The rain was cold. It came down her collar in the first 10 seconds. She pulled her hood up, and she pulled the drawstring tight, and she walked past the equipment barn and up the tractor track toward the northwest corner of the field. She could hear as she walked the water in the drainage ditch running harder than she had ever heard it run. She reached the northwest levee at 10:47 at night. She shined the flashlight along the top of the levee. The riprap she had installed 3 weeks earlier was still in place. The hardware cloth was still buried where she had buried it. The soft spots she had marked with the orange survey flags were holding. She swept the flashlight further down the levee. She saw the break at the far end. It was 15 feet past the reinforced section. It was a place she had not marked. It was a place she had not thought to reinforce. It was a place that had until that afternoon been the highest and firmest point of the entire levee. Now there was a 2-foot gap in the top of it. Water was pouring through the gap. Water was pouring out of her field in a steady, dark stream, cutting through the soft edge, carrying mud and rice straw, and every crawfish in the immediate vicinity into the drainage ditch beyond. Emmeline stood in the rain and looked at the break. She stood there for a full 3 seconds without moving. Then she was running back down the levee toward the tractor track, toward the equipment barn, toward the house, toward the phone, toward every sandbag she had ever stacked in her life, and she was yelling for her father, though she knew he could not come, and she was yelling for Cyrus, though he was 10 miles away, and she was yelling for anyone at all who could get to her field in the next 30 minutes. She reached the barn. She grabbed the phone off the wall. She dialed Doyle Melançon. She dialed him because Doyle Melançon had not laughed. Doyle Melançon picked up on the second ring. She said, "Mr. Melançon, Emmeline Fontenot, my levee has broken. My field is emptying. I need help." Doyle Melançon said, "Where?" She said, "Northwest corner, 15 feet past the riprap." Doyle Melançon said, "I am coming." He hung up. Emmeline stood in the barn with the phone in her hand. She thought about who else to call. She thought about the letter. Find the men who laughed at you first. She dialed the number for Père Baudouin, who ran the little feed store on the parish road, who had told her in September that he thought she was going to ruin her rice ground. Père Baudouin picked up on the 4th ring. Emmeline said, "Père, Emmeline Fontenot, my levee has broken. I need help." Père Baudouin said, "Bring what?" Emmeline said, "Sandbags, shovels, whoever you can find." Père Baudouin said, 15 minutes. He hung up. She dialed 3 more numbers. Every one of them said yes. Every one of them. At 11:14 that night, in a driving rain in the middle of what was becoming the worst. November storm, Iberia Parish had seen in 11 years. Doyle Melançon's pickup truck came skidding up the Fontenot Drive with 3 sons in it and a bed full of sandbags. Behind him, 60 seconds later, came Père Baudouin. Behind Père Baudouin, in the dark, in the rain, came 4 more pairs of headlights she did not recognize. Emmeline stood in the yard in her hood and her boots with a shovel in each hand and the rain running down her face and the flashlight beam cutting through the water, and she watched the trucks come. She thought, standing there in the rain, one clear thought. She thought they came. Then she turned and she led them up the tractor track, and 8 men and a 22-year-old woman went to work on the broken levee together in the dark. They worked until 3 in the morning. The rain stopped just before 2. The water in the field had dropped 9 inches by the time they got the break closed. Doyle Melançon stood beside Emmeline as the sky in the east began to gray, and he looked at the levee, and he looked at the field, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Emmeline." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "This wasn't the rain." She said, "No, sir." He said, "Somebody put a shovel through this." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You have a camera on that cypress." She said, "Yes, sir." Doyle Melançon looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Go check it." She went. She waded through the mud to the cypress tree. She climbed up on a stump. She opened the small waterproof housing. She took out the film canister. She held it in her hand. She walked back to Doyle Melançon. She said, "I have to develop it." He said, "In town. Booties does it in an hour. Be there when they open." She said, "Yes, sir." Doyle Melançon looked at her one more time in the gray light of the pre-dawn. He said, "Emmeline." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Your grandfather would be proud." He said it once. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been waiting a long time to say. Then he got in his truck and he drove home to sleep, because he was 67 years old, and he had been up all night in the rain and there was nothing left for him to do on the Fontenot place that morning. Emmeline stood in the mud with the film canister in her hand and the sun coming up behind her. She was tired. She was cold. She was covered in mud from her boots to her collar. She was smiling. She was smiling for the first time in 6 weeks, because she knew, standing there in the gray November morning with the rain gone and the field still holding and 8 men's tire tracks fresh in the drive, that she was no longer alone. She was not alone. And whoever had come with a shovel in the night was going to be on that roll of film. She got in her truck at 7:30. She drove to Bouthé's camera in New Iberia. She waited for it to open at 8. At 8:45, the man behind the counter handed her a paper envelope with 24 prints in it. She stood on the sidewalk outside Bout's camera on Main Street in New Iberia, and she opened the envelope with her muddy hands. She flipped through the photographs. Raccoons, nutria, heron, more raccoons. And then on the 18th photograph, taken at 11:06 the night before, at the exact moment the rain had first turned heavy, a photograph of a man on her levee. I was carrying a shovel. He was wearing a dark rain jacket. His face was turned toward the camera. She knew the face. She had never met him, but she knew the face. It was in the newspaper of the parish every summer, at the parade for the Sugar Cane Festival, standing in the back of the Grand Marshal's convertible, waving at the crowd. It was Tucker Landreneau, 26 years old, Lyle Marchetti's sister's boy, the nephew of the man who had told Emmeline Fontenot on her own porch that every Fontenot eventually sells. Emmeline held the photograph in her hand. She looked at Tucker Landreneau's face. She said out loud on the sidewalk of Main Street, "Got you." She stood on the sidewalk in front of Bout's camera for another minute after she said the words out loud. She stood there in her muddy jacket with the photograph in her hand and the traffic of Main Street moving slowly past her in the early sunshine, and she felt for the first time since her father had gone to one knee in the North Field in September, the particular kind of calm that comes over a person when they finally know what they are dealing with. She was not dealing with a farming problem. She was dealing with a man. A man had a face. A face could be taken to a lawyer. She got back in her truck. She drove to a phone booth on the corner of Main and Weeks. She put in a dime. She dialed the number Theo Lastrapes had given her the morning she had come to see him. She let it ring 4 times. He picked up on the 5th. He said, "Yes." She said, "It happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Theo said, "You have him." She said, "I have him." Theo said, "Who?" She said, "Tucker Landreneau." There was another silence. Then Theo said quietly, "Vincent's grandson." She said, "Yes, sir." Theo said, "So they used the same trick their father used and the boy is on the film." She said, "Yes, sir." Theo said, "Emmeline." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Do not go to the sheriff yet." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because if you go to the sheriff, they will pay a fine, and Tucker will get probation, and Lyle will come back at you sideways for the next 10 years. You have him on film breaking a levee. That is a civil matter. Do you understand the difference?" She said, "I think so." He said, "There is a lawyer in Lafayette. His name is Wilbert Deschotels. He is old. He hates Marchetti. He worked for the parish 40 years and knows every filthy thing the Marchettis have done since Vincent came to Iberia in 1952. You are going to call him this afternoon. and you are going to drive up there tomorrow. You are going to take the photograph. You are going to take the letter. You are going to take the map." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And Emmeline?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are going to win." He hung up. Emmeline stood in the phone booth on the corner of Main and Weeks in the sunshine of a November morning in 1985, and she took a breath, and she called Wilbert Deschotels. Wilbert Deschotels was 73 years old. He had an office on the second floor of a brick building on Jefferson Street in Lafayette above a shoe repair shop. His office had 2 windows, both of them dirty on the outside, and a ceiling fan that made a soft clicking sound at the third turn of each rotation, and a desk that had belonged to his own father, who had also been a lawyer, and who had, according to the small-frame diploma on the wall, graduated from Tulane in 1922. Wilbert Deschotels had gray hair he still combed. He wore a tie every day whether he had a client or not. He drank his coffee black. He had never been married. He had, when Emmeline sat down in the chair across from his desk on the following morning, been waiting for the phone call from a Fontenot for the better part of 26 years. He listened to her tell the whole story. He did not interrupt. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the map. He read the letter twice. He set the letter down on the desk between them, and he took off his reading glasses and he looked at Emmeline for a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup. He said, "Miss Fontenot." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I am going to file 3 things this week." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The first is a civil complaint for property damage and criminal trespass against Tucker Landreneau personally. That is the easy one. We will not settle it. We will take it to trial. I want a public record of what he did." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The second is a civil complaint against Marchetti Agricultural Holdings for tortious interference and conspiracy. This one is harder. But we have your grandfather's letter. We have Theo Lestrapes as a witness to the pattern going back to 1958. We have Vincent Marchetti's history of acquiring farms under duress in this parish, which I will subpoena bank records to prove. And we have, thanks to your camera, Vincent's grandson caught on film using the same method his grandfather used." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The third is a temporary restraining order preventing any Marchetti agent from setting foot on Fontenot property until this is resolved. That will go in today. It will be signed by tomorrow. It is a small thing, but it will make Lyle Marchetti very angry." He paused. He said, "You have been carrying this by yourself, Miss Fontenot." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are not going to carry it by yourself anymore. Do you understand me?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Now, about the crawfish." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How are they doing?" She almost laughed. She said, "I do not know yet." Wilbert Deschotels smiled. It was the first smile Emmeline had seen from him in 90 minutes. And he said, "Then we had better win in a hurry, because a good lawyer without a good story is only half a lawyer. And your story only ends if the field works." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Go home, check your traps, fix your levees, do your work, I will do mine." She drove home from Lafayette that afternoon with her hand steady on the wheel and something loosening in her chest that had been tight for 6 weeks. She reached the farm at 4 o'clock. She parked in the yard. She looked out toward the flooded 40 acres in the late November light. She thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it all the way. She walked to the barn. She took her waders down from the hook. She took the bucket of fish scraps out of the ice chest by the door. She walked out to the field and she got in the small flat-bottom boat she had built in October, and she began to run the traps. The first trap came up with 3 crawfish in it. The second trap came up with 5. The third trap came up with 8. The fourth trap came up with 11. Emmeline stopped rowing for a moment. She looked at the trap in her hands. She looked at the pile of crawfish in the bottom of the bucket at her feet. She looked out across the field at the tea-colored water and the ridge of cypress on the far side and the low gray November sky. She said out loud in the empty boat, "There you are." She said it the way a person greets a friend who has come back after a long absence. She said it the way her grandfather might have said it in 1957 on his own boat, in his own field. Before Vincent Marchetti had come to his door, she ran 12 more traps. She caught a total of 93 crawfish that afternoon. It was not a large harvest, but it was a harvest, and she understood rowing back to the levee in the fading light with the bucket at her feet that the field was going to work. The field was going to work. Everything else she thought was going to be a matter of how hard she was willing to fight. The trial began on the 14th of March. That was 2.5 months later. In the interval, Emmeline had lived a life she could not have imagined for herself in September. She had run traps every 3 days through December and January and February in every weather, in cold that had numbed her fingers, and once in a February heat spell that had turned the water sour and killed a small percentage of the population before she caught the temperature and cut the water depth to bring it back into balance. She had harvested 3,200 pounds of crawfish by the second week of March. At market, that was almost $11,000. It was not enough to save the farm alone, but combined with the operating cash the rice crop would bring in July, it was enough. It was enough to buy fuel. It was enough to cover the note. It was enough to keep the 200 acres on the west side of the bayou where her grandfather Alcide was buried. She had also learned to read her own field. She had learned which corners held the temperature best in a cold snap and which corners went sour first in a warm one. She had learned to walk her levees every morning at first light and to see in the way the vegetation had settled overnight, whether the pressure of the water had shifted underground. She had learned to trust the field, and she had learned to distrust her own confidence in it, and she had learned that both of those things could be true at the same time. She had also quietly, and without telling anyone, taken over the running of the entire farm. Ansel Fontenot was still recovering. I was better than he had been in October. He could walk to the barn. He could sit on the porch. He could read the account book for himself now. But he could not run the outside work, and he did not try, and one afternoon in early February he had sat down across from Emmeline at the kitchen table and had said without any softening at all, "I am not coming back to the field." She had said, "I know." He had said, "I want to sign the operating authority over to you." She had said, "All right." They had gone into Lafayette the next day. Wilbert Deschâtels had drawn the papers. Ansel Fontenot had signed them at 4:12 in the afternoon on the 6th of February in 1986, and Emmeline Fontenot had become on paper the operator of the Fontenot place. She had not told her mother. Her father had told her mother. Her mother had cried a little and had held Emmeline's hands across the kitchen table that evening and had said, "Your grandmother would have been so proud of you, Cher." Emmeline had said, "I know, Mama." She had not cried. She had used up her crying in the middle of the night in her bedroom the week she had read her grandfather's letter, and she had not had much crying left in her since. The trial was held in the courthouse in New Iberia. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. It had wooden benches and high windows and a slow ceiling fan, and a judge named Bernard Simonio, who had lived in Iberia Parish since before Vincent Marchetti had ever set foot in it. Judge Simonio was 69 years old that spring. He had known Alcide Fontenot socially. He had not known him well. But he had known him well enough to remember when the case came onto his docket that Alcide had been a good man and that the manner of his death in 1963 had left more than one man in the parish with unanswered questions. Lyle Marchetti sat at the defendant's table on the first morning of the trial in a dark suit with a red tie. Tucker Landreneau sat beside him. Tucker looked 26 years old and afraid. Emmeline sat at the plaintiff's table beside Wilbert Deschâtel's. She was wearing a pale blue button-down shirt her mother had ironed for her, and a khaki skirt and low brown shoes. She had her hair pulled back. She had a small notebook and a pen in front of her on the table. She was 22 years old and she was small, and she looked to the jury of 12 men and women that Wilbert Deschâtel's had spent 3 days selecting like exactly what she was. She looked like a farm girl. Wilbert Deschâtel's rose to give his opening statement at 9:45 in the morning. He walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. He did not look at Lyle Marchetti. He looked at the jury. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about a family." I said, "It is a case about a family that has grown rice on Bayou Maringouin for 4 generations. It is a case about a young woman, 22 years old, who took over that family's farm last fall because her father almost died in September. It is a case about a rice field she was trying to make work in a way her grandfather had tried to make it work in the year 1958. And about a man who came to her door and offered to buy her farm, and who, when she said no, sent his nephew to break her levee with a shovel." He paused. He said, "But it is also, ladies and gentlemen, a case about a pattern." He said, "And I am going to prove that pattern to you over the next 4 days." He sat down. The trial ran as Wilbert Deschâtel's had predicted, 4 days. He put Emmeline on the stand on the first afternoon. She testified for 2 hours. She described the September morning her father had gone to one knee in the north field. She described coming home from Lafayette. She described the account book. She described the conversation with her father about the 40 acres. She described the day Lyle Marchetti had come to her porch in his black Cadillac and offered to buy the farm. She described the phrase he had used before he left. "Every Fontenot is stubborn, and every one of them eventually sells." She described the tin box under the 3rd floorboard from the north wall of the equipment barn. She described the map her grandfather had drawn in 1958. She described the letter her grandfather had written to her in 1963 and had never lived to send. Wilbert Deschâtel's entered the letter into evidence. He read it aloud to the jury. He read the last paragraph twice. "Find the men who laughed at you first. Those are the men who will fight for you last." Emmeline watched from the witness stand. One of the jurors, a man in his 50s in a green work shirt, take out a handkerchief and press it against his right eye. She watched 2 of the other jurors nod slowly at the same time. She thought, "My grandfather is winning this trial. Not me. Him." Wilbert Deschâtel's put Doyle Melanson on the stand next. Doyle told the story of the night of the storm. He described the phone call. He described the drive over. He described what he had found on the northwest levee. He described the shape of the cut. He said without any hesitation that it was a deliberate cut, made with a long-handled shovel, and that no rain in Louisiana had ever produced a cut of that shape in his 50 years of walking levees in this parish. Wilbert Deschâtel's put Theo Lastrapes on the stand on the morning of the 3rd day. Theo Lastrapes was sworn in with his right hand on the courthouse Bible. He wore the same dark blue suit he had worn to Alcide Fontenot's funeral in 1963. He was 78 years old, and his voice was thinner than it had been at his kitchen table 5 months before. but it carried across the small third-floor courtroom without shaking. He testified for an hour and a half. He described Vincent Marchetti's first visit to Alcide Fontenot in September of 1958. He described the second visit in October and the third visit in November, and the words Vincent had said on the porch before he left. He described the night the shovel had come through Alcide Fontenot's levee, and he described walking that levee with Alcide the next morning, in the dark before dawn, and he described the shape of the cut, which he said without any hesitation was the same shape as the cut Doyle Melanson had described from the previous November. He described Alcide Fontenot after that night. He said he was not the same man. He said he tried for 3 more winters, but he did not believe anymore. He believed in the water, but he did not believe he was going to be allowed to have it. He said he died in 1963 of a heart that had, in my opinion, given up before his body did. The prosecution rested on the third afternoon. Lyle Marchetti's lawyer put Tucker Landreneau on the stand. Tucker Landreneau denied everything. Tucker Landreneau said he had been at a bar in New Iberia on the night of November 14th. He said he had witnesses. He named 3 of them. Wilbert Deschâtels cross-examined Tucker Landreneau for 45 minutes. He asked him at the end one question. He said, "Mr. Landreneau, I want to show you a photograph." He held up an 8x10 print. The photograph was the 18th photograph from the roll of film Emmeline had developed at Boutet's camera the morning after the storm. The photograph showed Tucker Landreneau in a dark rain jacket carrying a shovel standing on the Fontenot levee. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph read, 11:06 p.m. November 14th, 1985. Wilbert Deschâtels said, "Is that you, Mr. Landreneau?" Tucker Landreneau did not answer. Wilbert Deschâtels said, "Sir, the court has asked you a question." Tucker Landreneau looked at his uncle. Lyle Marchetti did not look back. Tucker Landreneau said in a voice that had gone very small, "Yes." Wilbert Deschâtels said, "Thank you." He sat down. The defense rested on the morning of the 4th day. Wilbert Deschâtels gave his closing argument at 2 in the afternoon. He walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked at the jury. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you one more story before you go back to deliberate." He said, "In 1958, a man named Alcide Fontenot did what his granddaughter Emmeline has done. He flooded a rice field in the winter. He raised crawfish in it. He wrote down what he learned. He was one of the first men in this parish to try it. He was on the day the photograph in that tin box was taken in October of 1958, the happiest he had been since the war. He said 2 weeks later, someone put a shovel through his levee in the middle of the night. He said Alcide Fontenot never recovered. He tried for 3 more winters. He gave up in 1961. He died in 1963 of a heart that had, in the opinion of his best friend, given out from too much silence and too much unfought fight. He said the man who put the shovel through Alcide Fontenot's levee in 1958 was named Vincent Marchetti. He was the father of the man sitting at that table. He pointed at Lyle Marchetti. He said, "The man who put the shovel through Emmeline Fontenot's levee in November of 1985 was Tucker Landreneau. He is Vincent Marchetti's grandson. He is Lyle Marchetti's nephew. He was hired by the man sitting at that table." He said, "This is not the story of one bad night," he said. "This is the story of a family that has been trying to break a smaller family for 27 years. And this jury is going to be the first group of 12 people in the history of this parish who ever get to say out loud in front of a judge whether that is going to be allowed." He said, "I trust you with that. Thank you." He sat down. The jury went out at 3:15. The jury came back at 4:42. Emmeline stood up at the plaintiff's table. Wilbert Deschâtel stood beside her. The foreman was the man in the green work shirt. He read the verdict. The jury found in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. They awarded damages of $48,000 against Tucker Landreneau. Personally, they awarded damages of $300,000 against Marchetti Agricultural Holdings for tortious interference and conspiracy. They awarded punitive damages at the recommendation of the plaintiff's counsel and at the discretion of the court of an additional $200,000 against Marchetti Agricultural Holdings on the finding that the conduct in question had been part of a deliberate and long-standing pattern. Judge Bernard Simonot entered the judgment at 4:57 in the afternoon on the 17th of March, 1986. Emmeline sat down slowly in the wooden chair at the plaintiff's table. She put her hands flat on the wood in front of her. She looked down at them. She saw on the back of her right hand the small crescent-shaped scar she had gotten in the 7th grade from a rice stalk that had cut her when she had reached her hand into the header of her father's combine to clear a jam. She thought that hand belongs to me. She thought this farm belongs to me. She did not cry. She did not smile. She sat very still, and she listened to the sound of the courtroom emptying around her, and she felt something enormous and quiet settle into the boards of the floor beneath her feet. She looked up. Wilbert Deschâtel was looking at her. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me, Miss Fontenot." She said, "Then who?" He said, "Thank your grandfather." She stood up. She walked to the back of the courtroom. Theo Lastrapes was sitting in the last row of benches on the right. He had come every day of the trial. He was wearing the same dark blue suit he had worn on the stand 2 days before, and he was 78 years old. And he was crying quietly without any effort to hide it, the way he had cried at Alcide Fontenot's funeral in 1963. Emmeline sat down beside him. She put her hand on his. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Theo said, "He is at rest now." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You did it, child." She said, "We did it." She meant we. She meant her grandfather and Theo. Lastrapes and Doyle Melançon and Père Baudouin and Cyrus Duplessis and Wilbert Deschâtel and the 7 other men who had come up her drive in the rain on the night of November 14th, and her father who had let her try, and her mother who had ironed her shirt that morning, and every man and woman who had walked past the Fontenot place in the last 4 generations and had chosen to be a neighbor. She meant all of them. Theo Lastrapes understood. He squeezed her hand. He said, "I know you did share." They drained the field in the 2nd week of March. Emmeline had opened the water gate on a Thursday afternoon 4 days before the verdict came in because the field could not wait for the trial to end. She had drained fields her whole life. She had done it with her father as a small child, standing beside him at the control box while he pulled the boards up one at a time and let the water go. And she had done it more times than she could count in the 12 years since. She knew before she ever opened the gate exactly what draining a field sounded like and looked like and smelled like. But this drain was different. She had over 5 months put 28,000 gallons of water on this field. She had lived beside that water. She had walked around it in the fog and rowed a boat across it in the dark. She had watched it hold 93 crawfish in one afternoon and 3,200 pounds in one season and one man's shovel in one night. And she had, without quite realizing it, come to think of the water as something living. She was draining it now. She pulled the top board. Water began to move. It moved slowly at first, sliding through the screen into the drainage ditch. Then it moved faster. Then over the course of the afternoon, the level dropped inch by inch, and the tops of the softened rice stubble began to reappear above the water. And by evening, the shallow channels in the field were visible again, and the low corner in the southwest where her grandfather Alcide had told her in the map to leave a deeper pocket for the animals was still holding a small pool of water for the last of the crawfish to retreat into before the final trapping. She stood on the levee at dusk. She looked out at the field. The residue was darker than the residue on the neighboring fields. It was softer. It was more broken. Much of it no longer formed the thick, dry mats that Ansel Fontenot's Northfield had every year in the third week of March. The crawfish had not made it disappear. They had participated in a process that had changed it. They had fed on it and moved through it and produced waste that had returned to the water, and the water had carried it through the soil in a way that a plow could not have carried it. Her father came up to the field in a small four-wheeler her Uncle Remy had bought him for the recovery. He rode slowly up the tractor track. He parked at the top of the rise where the drive met the field. He climbed off. He walked to the edge of the drained field. He crouched down. He picked up a handful of the wet, dark soil. He held it in his palm. He broke it apart between his fingers. He let it fall. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This ground isn't bad." Emmeline said, "You think so?" He said, "Don't get carried away." But he was smiling. He was smiling the way she had seen him smile in one photograph from before she was born, and the way she had never seen him smile in her whole life. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked to see this." She said, "He does see it, Daddy." Ansel Fontenot looked at his daughter. He said, "I believe you share." He stood up slowly. He put his arm around her shoulders. He kept it there for a long time. They planted the North 40 on the 24th of March, a week after the verdict. They planted it with the same equipment they had used every spring, with the same seed rice from the co-op, with the same schedule Ansel Fontenot had followed for 30 years. But they used less fertilizer. They used less fuel per acre in the initial pass because the residue was easier to incorporate. They used less water because the field's water table had held better through the winter. The rice came up on the 8th of April. It came up thick. It came up green. It came up in a way that anyone driving past on the parish road would have noticed if they had cared to notice. Doyle Melançon drove past on the 11th of April. He stopped. He got out of his truck. He walked into the field. He crouched down. He looked at the young rice plants. He ran his hand along the top of the stand. He straightened up. He looked at Emmeline, who had come up from the barn on foot when she had seen his truck. He said, "Emmeline." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You have 20 acres I can borrow." She said, "Borrow." He said, "I want to try it in the fall, on the 20 acres by the pond. Same system. I want to run it. I want to talk to you about how." She looked at him. She smiled. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I will pay you for your time." She said, "Doyle." He said, "I will pay you for your time. I am not a charity case." She said, "All right." He said, "I want to bring my grandson. He is 19. He is going to have to learn how this works because you and him are going to be running the water on this bayou when I am dead." She said, "Bring him whenever you want." Doyle Melançon nodded once. He said, "Your grandfather Alcide." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "He came to see my daddy once, in 1957. He asked my daddy for help with the water on the 40. My daddy said no. He said no because he was afraid Vincent Marchetti would come after him next if he was seen helping. He said, "My daddy died in 1971. He never told anybody that story except me. He told me because he wanted somebody to know he had regretted it. He regretted it for 14 years. He said, I am not going to regret it, Emmeline." He said, "Not on my watch." He got back in his truck. He drove home. Emmeline stood in the young rice. The wind moved across the tops of the plants, and the whole field shivered green from one end to the other. She thought we are not alone anymore. She thought we are never going to be alone again. By the end of the summer of 1986, 4 other farms on Bayou Maringouin had flooded fields for crawfish. By the end of the summer of 1987, there were 11. By 1990, there were 29. Wilbert Deschotels collected the damages from Marchetti Agricultural Holdings on the 14th of April, 1986. He took his fee. He handed Emmeline a check for $431,000. Emmeline used the money to pay off the farm's note. She used the rest to build a small processing shed on the property, so that the Fontenot place and its neighbors could sell live crawfish directly to buyers in New Orleans and Houston without going through a broker. She paid Cyrus Duplessis a full salary for the first time in his life. She hired his brother, Lyle Marchetti, sold Marchetti Agricultural Holdings in 1988, and moved to Baton Rouge. Tucker Landreneau served 11 months of a 2-year sentence for criminal trespass and property destruction, and worked when he came home as a night manager at a truck stop on Interstate 10. He never came back to Iberia Parish. Ansel Fontenot lived until the spring of 2001. He never worked another combine, but he sat on the porch every fall to watch the water go on the field and every spring to watch the water come off, and he lived for the last 15 years of his life in a small piece of quiet that his own father had never quite been able to find. He died in his sleep on the 2nd of April, 2001 at the age of 74. The last thing he said to Emmeline on the evening of the 1st before he went upstairs to bed was one line. He said, "You did it, Cher." She said, "We did it, Daddy." He said, "I know." He went up the stairs slowly. He did not come down again. Theo Lastrapes died in 1992. I was buried in New Iberia beside his wife who had died in 1978. Emmeline attended the funeral. She stood in the front pew beside Theo's daughter who had flown in from Houston. She wept openly this time because she had used up her not crying on the day of the trial and had in the intervening 6 years become a person who could cry when it was time to cry. She helped carry the casket. She was the only woman among the pallbearers. Theo's daughter had asked her to. Doyle Melanson died in 2006. He was 88 years old. His grandson, whose name was Rémi Melancon, ran the 20 acres by the pond on the same rotation Doyle had started in 1986. He came to Emmeline for advice twice a year in October and in March, and she gave it the way Theo Lastrapes had given it to her. Emmeline married in 1993. She married a man named Baudouin Landry, who owned a small sugarcane operation east of Lauraville and who had come to her to ask if she thought a crawfish rotation would work on the low ground next to his mill. She had told him yes. They had, in the course of that conversation, taken 20 minutes to talk about crawfish and 3 hours to talk about everything else. They had married on the 11th of October, 1993. Clémence had been born in 1996. She was on the morning of this story, 12 years old, and she was sitting on the porch step of the farmhouse in October of 2008, looking at the tin box in her mother's hands. Emmeline finished the story. She closed the tin box. She set it on the porch railing. The heron had come back. It was standing on the far bank of the bayou now in the sun that had finally burned through the mist, watching something in the water that only it could see. Clémence had not spoken through the whole telling. She spoke now. She said, "Mama." Emmeline said, "Yes, cher." Clémence said, "Are they still here?" Emmeline said, "Who?" Clémence said, "The Marchettis." Emmeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There are still Marchettis in the parish. Lyle died in Baton Rouge in 2003. His son runs an accounting firm in Houston. He does not farm. Tucker Landreneau, who was Lyle's nephew, works in Slidell. He has 3 children. I have never spoken to him since the trial." She said, "The family is not the family it was." She said, "The parish is not the parish it was either." She said, "There are 29 farms on this bayou that run the rotation your great-grandfather figured out. Some of them are Fontenots. Some of them are Melancons. Some of them are Landrys from your father's side. Some of them are families that would not have known any Fontenot from any tree stump 40 years ago. All of them run water in the fall now. All of them harvest crawfish in the winter. All of them plant rice in the spring." She said, "Your great-grandfather is in the water of every one of those fields, cher. Every one." Clémence looked at the tin box. She said, "Mama." Emmeline said, "Yes." Clémence said, "Is this mine now?" Emmeline looked at her daughter for a long moment. She said, "It is." She said, "I want you to keep it. I want you to put it somewhere safe. I want you to read the letter your great-grandfather wrote to me. I want you to look at the map. I want you to look at the photograph of him and Theo Lastrapes standing on the levee in 1958, and I want you to remember that he was 54 years old in that picture, and that he was happy for a little while, and that he stopped being happy for reasons that were not his fault, and that his happiness came back into this world through his granddaughter, 27 years after he died." She said, "That is what I want you to remember." Clémence said, "Yes, Mama." Emmeline said, "One more thing." Clémence said, "Yes." Emmeline said, "Your great-grandfather wrote something at the top of the map, in English, in pencil. It is the only line on the whole map that is not in French. I want you to read it now." She opened the tin box. She lifted the map out. She unfolded it. She held it out to her daughter. Clémence took the map. She was quiet as she looked at it. Her mother had told her the story, but she had not yet seen the map with her own eyes. And Emmeline understood, watching her daughter's face in the morning light, that this was the moment she had been waiting for since Clémence was born. Clémence found the line. She read it out loud. She said, "Ideas do not die, they wait." She looked up at her mother. She said, "What does that mean, Mama?" Emmeline said, "It means what happened to us, cher." She said, "It means that your great-grandfather had an idea in 1958. It means that a man came to his door and told him the idea was worthless and then broke his levee to prove it. It means that your great-grandfather stopped fighting for the idea, but he did not stop believing in it. He wrote it down. He put it in a box. He hid it under the 3rd floorboard of the barn. He waited." She said, "He waited 27 years. He waited for me. He waited until I was old enough to find the box and afraid enough to open it and stubborn enough to finish what he could not finish." She said, "That is what he meant. Ideas do not die if somebody keeps them. Ideas wait for the right person." She said, "Sometimes the right person is not the person you thought." She said, "Sometimes the right person is the granddaughter you never met." Clémence looked at the map for another long minute. Then she said, "Mama." Emmeline said, "Yes, cher." Clémence said, "What am I supposed to do with this?" Emmeline said, "You do not have to do anything with it today." She said, "You keep it. You put it in the top drawer of your dresser. You take it with you when you go to college if you go. You take it with you if you leave the parish. You take it with you if you go to another country. You keep it until the day comes when somebody knocks on your door and tries to tell you that something you believe in is worthless. She said, and when that day comes, Cher, you open the box, and you read the letter, and you remember what he did, and you decide then what you are going to do about it. She said, that is all. Clémence folded the map carefully. She put it back in the box. She closed the lid. She held the box against her chest with both arms the way a small girl holds a doll. She was not a small girl anymore. She looked sitting on the porch step in her rubber boots with her mother's tin box in her arms like a young woman who had in the last 90 minutes become a slightly different person. She said, Mama. Emmeline said yes. Clémence said, can I go show it to Daddy? Emmeline smiled. She said, yes, Cher. Clémence stood up. She walked down the porch steps. She walked across the yard in her 2 big boots with the tin box in her arms, and the sunlight caught the medium brown of her hair with its warm chestnut and sun-lightened streaks, and Emmeline Fontenot. Landry, 45 years old. That October sat on the porch of the farmhouse she had inherited and fought for and kept, and she watched her daughter go. She watched her daughter go the way her grandfather Alcide had on his own porch, in the fall of 1963, watched a granddaughter. He could not yet see walking into a future he could not yet imagine. She thought this is what he meant. She thought this is what all of it meant. She thought the field is out there. The water is running. The rice is coming up in 6 months. The crawfish are already in the mud, though nobody can see them yet. She thought ideas do not die. She thought they wait. A long way out over the bayou, the heron lifted off the far bank. It beat its wings twice. It rose slowly into the sun. Emmeline sat on the porch and watched it go until it was only a small, dark shape against the pale blue morning. And then she picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and she took a long, slow sip of it anyway, because it was the coffee she had made that morning in the kitchen. Her grandfather had once stood in, and it was still the best coffee she had ever tasted, and it was still at 45 years old, the coffee of home. That is the whole story. That is what was in the tin box.